Hey, everybody. Welcome to Big Blend Radio's Way Back When History Show with your host, Nancy Reed and Lisa Smith. We're the mother-daughter travel team on the Love Your Park store and publishers of Big Blend Radio and TV magazine and Parks and Travel magazine. Both are digital publications. You can see them on bigblendmagazines.com. We're excited to have military historian, U.S. Army veteran, and award-winning author Mike Guardia back on the show today. He's an expert in both our publications and a frequent guest here on Big Blend Radio. And Mike doesn't stop writing. Every time we turn around, there's another book out. And his latest one, I know, is American Armor in the Pacific. It is the latest in the Casemate Illustrated series. It explores American armor during the Pacific campaign of World War II from 1942 to 1945. We're talking tanks today. And last time Mike was on the show, we were talking about the combat history of the F-14 in his book Tomcat Fury. So that's one of his latest. And I think he's got how many military, Mike, how many books now? It's like I'm trying to count. You're getting quite the list. Is it 12? More than that?
It's actually 15.
Wow. See? Wow, dude. I can't keep track of all of these. It's exciting. You know, we first met you coming on our shows talking about Hal Moore. You've written Hal Moore, A Soldier Once and Always. Also American Guerrilla, The Forgotten Heroics of Russell W. Volkman. Shadow Commander, The Epic Story of Donald D. Blackburn. There's The Fires of Babylon, Eagle Troop, and the Battle of 73 Easting. Of course, more on Hal Moore. You've got Hal Moore on Leadership. You've also got Hal Moore, A Life in Pictures. There's Crusader, General Don Starry, and the Army of His Times. Can I take a breath yet?
Sure.
Got a lot going on there. But of course, everyone, you can go to Amazon and get Mike's books there. But I also encourage you to go to his website, mikeguardia.com. You've got his list of books there, and you can also keep up with him on Facebook and on Twitter as well. So welcome back. Man, this is quite an epic book. So is a paperback as well as Kindle edition, right?
That's right.
Oh, man. And all these tanks, what is very interesting to me is that you talk about how these tanks weren't, you think about, World War II and World War I, you think about tanks in Europe. And, this is a little bit of a different condition between 42 and 45 when you're thinking about the Pacific Theater, that this was really, they were in swampy tropical terrain. So this was a different kind of battle.
Exactly. I think typically when people think of World War II in the Pacific, they really think of jungle battles. They think infantry, they think artillery, they think of the amphibious vehicles that stormed the beachheads. But I don't think that proper attention historically has been given to the critical role that tanks have played in that particular theater of the conflict. And I think that tank warfare as a whole within the Pacific theater has really been underrated and more than a little underrepresented as well.
And what about for the soldiers, because they had to make adjustments, right? Because it's like a whole different game. So then doesn't that change the mechanics and all of a sudden maybe we're getting stuck in the mud, or are we, all that kind of thing?
Absolutely, it does. The terrain in the Pacific was just a night and day difference from what you saw in Europe. Over on the continent of Europe, you had these wide open fields, and you had terrain that was really amenable to tank warfare, and even more so in the desert plains of North Africa. But if you go halfway around the world to the Pacific, just a complete difference in the terrain. You have narrow confines. You have soil that's not really friendly for tank warfare. You have to deal with you have to deal with the tropical weather, which can very quickly turn from sunny skies without a cloud in sight to your stereotypical monsoon rains, which makes the terrain even more unbearable for tank warfare. So for them, it was as much of a tactical challenge as it was a technical challenge, trying to employ the tank in a way that would actually make it helpful in, these volcanic ash islands that we were storming in our Pacific Island hopping campaign.
So how do they decide what weapons? I mean, how they gather the intelligence to then make decisions of what weapons to use and where and when? How do they make those decisions?
Well, a lot of it depends really on what your enemy has going into the fight. When we started the Pacific Campaign proper in 1942, we knew that the Japanese army had an armored force, at least on paper. The tanks that they had at the time were not very good. They were mechanically troublesome. A lot of them did very poorly in the field. But the Japanese, they at least knew how to use the poor tanks that they had to somewhat of an advantage when they occupied the islands that they did. So knowing the equipment that your enemy has really is the first thing that any military planner takes into consideration when they're planning their operations. So we knew that if the Japanese had tanks and that they had them on the various islands throughout the Pacific, we knew that we had to have some type of armored force to counter that. We didn't want to be in a position where we were just sending Marines and sending foot soldiers onto an island to stand toe to toe against any variety of Japanese tanks that would be there. And another consideration that they had to take was what the weather was going to be like and what the terrain itself was going to be like. Since you could storm Pacific Island during broad daylight and during fair weather, and that would facilitate the use of one type of weapon. You could say, okay, well, the terrain on this island is going to be suitable for tanks as long as the temperature, stays above 75 degrees and the skies are clear. But if you take that same island and now you're being hit by a torrential downpour, well, that changes the dynamics of the soil. So instead of using a Sherman tank, you would have to use maybe a lighter landing craft and rely more on offshore naval gunfire than anything else.
Wow. So this was kind of a different thing either, because they weren't even just like, going nose to nose, and it wasn't like the tank is, you just at the beginning, I always thought tanks were more of a way of going in like the Trojan horse. Like it's kind of protective and you can shoot without getting, nailed as much. And reading this book and going through it, it looks like this is considered more of a weapon than a modes of protected transportation that I initially thought of years ago. It's like, okay, wait, I've been looking at tanks the wrong way.
Well, it was certainly a weapon, and it was definitely a force multiplier, because one of the things that I think the Japanese understood was that they knew their days were numbered. After Pearl Harbor and after they had failed to sink the carrier group that they thought was going to be at Pearl Harbor, they knew that they only had maybe about 6 months to 2 years to really hold their own before the Americans would eventually overwhelm all their positions. So knowing that they were going to fight a losing battle, they pretty much adopted the mentality of how slowly can I lose? So they fortified the islands the best they could. They dug in trenches, they dug in pillboxes, and they used their tanks as either static defense weapons or things that they would use after drawing American forces inland as much as they could. So that being the case, that's where the tank really became a force multiplier, because if you have either a dozen or so Japanese soldiers who are holed up in a bunker and they are willing to fight to the last man, you can take out the bunker a lot quicker and a lot more efficiently with a tank than if you were to just throw a squad of infantry at it.
So yeah, it's a whole new way of things, happening. It's interesting too, because you're going against the Japanese, and the Japanese used to be our allies, right? And so this was a big changeover. And at the same time, didn't we have Japanese fighting for us? And then we had them, there was the internment camps. Am I getting my timeline here? You have a great timeline in the beginning of the book too. But in regards to the Japanese, it's just, I know we were talking the one time about the spy, the doll collector lady who was the spy, got nailed. But what was going on? I mean, that had to be a shift, and that had to be a big shift for the country. Nancy, I know for you, this was, before you were born, but you were raised through that shift of how do we feel about, Japanese people? Because, there's a lot of cool people, but at the same time, it was
a big deal. I remember my grandmother and my parents talking about it, and my mom never said the word Japanese. She called them something else, And, there was definitely, she went from one side to the other. I remember talking about when she was in school and military came in and removed Japanese children from the schools, and they put them into the internment camps. And part of the kids that, some of the kids that were taken away were her friends. So she was sad about that, didn't understand it. And then a few years later, she was against all Japanese. And even now to this day, still has a thing about Japanese, and it's funny, that hangover of feelings.
Right.
And I didn't go through the war, so I don't have that kind of feeling at all. To me, it's part of history. But I could see it on my parents, the absolute fear and hatred of anybody that was on the other side during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just,
Is
they didn't seem to recover from it.
But this was the time frame where everything shifted and how the Japanese, they were after China, right? This was and they weren't being really nice about it. They weren't doing war with the same tactics.
Right, right. So it was kind of an interesting relationship that we had with the Empire of Japan back then. Coming out of World War One, they were one of our staunchest allies, and pretty much right up until around 1939 or so, we regarded them as one of our closest friends in the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
What really started the downhill slope for U.S.-Japanese relations right around the time the war kicked off for us was a remilitarization of Japan following World War One, and right around the same time, and there are a lot of things that factored into this, but along with the revamping of its military, there was a reintroduction and a perversion, really, of what they called the Bushido Warrior Code. And in ancient times, the Bushido Warrior Code was a strict code of conduct that the samurai lived by. And back then, the Bushido Code said that even though you were a warrior, you were also a humanitarian, and you always treated your opponents with dignity, even after they were defeated. Well, fast forward to around 1932 or so, the Bushido Warrior Code had been perverted into something that you would see coming out of the Cobra Kai dojo of the Karate Kid. Strike first, strike hard, show no mercy, and anyone who surrenders to you should be considered lower than a dog. So you take that mentality that starts to pervert the ranks of the Japanese high command, and then you have a reignition of conflict with mainland China, and that manifests itself in the Second Sino-Japanese War, where Japan really came out on top as the heavy victor. And it was also during that campaign that you saw the Japanese military, largely inspired by this perversion of the Bushido Code, saying, okay, we can commit all these atrocities against the people here on mainland China and not have any remorse for it. And they really go to extremes. And, being that all of these atrocities were committed in public view and it was broadcast in headlines all across the world, that's really what soured our relationship to them, because the things that we were seeing were just, so far-fetched that I think any sentient person would have taken offense to it. You had live Chinese civilians who were being strapped to poles and used for bayonet practice. You had mass executions, you had tortures, you had rapes. There was one particularly, I'll call it equally interesting and equally disturbing incident where you had this one Japanese unit who was raiding a maternity ward, and they would throw these Chinese babies up into the air, and then they would catch them on bayonets.
Oh my gosh!
And it was, and here's where the irony comes in. It was so disturbing that a Nazi attaché, I mean, we're talking an officer from the German army,
Mm.
who was a strict adherent to the Nazi ideology. Okay, a Nazi attaché was with that Japanese unit, and he came up to them and he was shouting, "No, no, stop this! This is too brutal. This is too violent." And just think about the irony of that. If you have a Nazi, of all people, telling you that you're being too rough and too violent, you know you done screwed up real bad.
I
Yeah.
know. And at the same time, Japan went on the side of the Nazis, right? So here we are as America going, we're not pro-Nazi and we're going against the Nazis, and now that means we're really going after Japan at the same time. But I agree with you. I mean, the Nazi, that's just it. It's horrible,
Yeah.
the whole thing. But those two being together.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole World War I, after the the war's over, everybody's happy. That kind of went away, like pretty fast with all of this.
Oh, the war that was going to end all wars, but it didn't.
Right.
No.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's interesting the cruelty that was shown in the tortures, and I remember my parents talking about they would take bamboo shoots and put them between your toenails and your fingernails and your flesh, and all these like things that boggles the mind, because who would think of that? So I think that the whole world went into shock over this kind of behavior, because that wasn't, there was that term for a while, gentleman's war, like you treat the person that you're warring against, once you catch them, you treat them with respect, because if you get captured, you want to be treated with respect and dignity, and that even elevates the war, in that you're warring against another factor, but you respect them, as people, and even you might disagree with their ideology or whatever, but you didn't become subhuman. And it just seems to me that the Second World War started that decline of respect for each
Anything
other
goes.
as people. And not even, the tortures weren't even needed or warranted, actually. It seemed out of line, like they didn't have to do that at all. They've already had their captives. They didn't need to go further than that. But for whatever reason.
Do we have that like in place now? Like I know we've got some fragile situations and things like that going on now. Do we have that in place now, that, like a global conduct of like how we don't nuke each other and do all kinds of torturous things?
Absolutely, we do. Now, it's a different question if everybody chooses to follow it, because there are some people out there who don't. But the whole premise behind the Geneva Convention was that when countries go to war, there are certain things you can do, and there are certain things that you should never do. And of all of the militaries in the world, it's expected that they have to abide by the Geneva Convention, and that is, it's a very lengthy list that prescribes what's legal and what's not legal in wartime. Gone are the days where a lot of the civilized nations say that anything goes in war. Well, no, according to the Geneva Conventions, one, you can't use chemical weapons. If anyone surrenders to you, you have to accept their surrender. You can't shoot prisoners of war. And you have to ensure that when an enemy prisoner of war is taken aboard, that they're treated fairly and that they're treated decently. You can't engage in what's a qualitative torture tactic, essentially.
And so
that would be a war crime if they break those rules. That they would be now accused of war crimes. Is there anything what happens to someone or a country that's accused of war crimes? Is there any, like, okay, so it's not just, is there any follow-up to saying you have committed war crimes? What happens to that country?
Right, absolutely. And to a great extent, that's what happened to Japan and Germany after the war. In the case of Germany, for example, you had the Nuremberg trials where a lot of SS and Nazis were put on the stand, and e- even the Allied Commission and the judge who was presiding over these trials, said, "Hey, it is no excuse to say that you were just following orders, because
Mm.
you as a thinking person who has a demonstrable sense of what's right and wrong, you should have a moral duty to disobey orders that are not lawful or ones that would put innocent people in harm's way." So yeah, that's why a lot of former Nazis went to the gallows. That's
Mm.
also why also a lot of folks within the Japanese high command also went to the gallows
Mm.
afterwards.
But at the same
They
time,
said
I was going to say at the same time, we still did have Japanese fight on our side, right? That was like a
we did.
small.
We had
Mm.
Yeah. Well, we had quite a few Japanese Americans
Mhm.
who were first generation American
Okay.
born, and they were the children of Japanese immigrants. That's actually a pretty interesting story in and of itself.
Mm.
If you are a Japanese American and you were born as a first generation American citizen, i.e., you are the child of folks who immigrated from Japan, there's a special term that they use to describe that. It's called a nisai,
Mm.
Mm.
and there were a lot of Japanese Americans. I mean, folks who were just as loyal as you and I.
Mhm.
Guys who had first names like Joe and Phil and Tommy, but their last names were like Tanaka and
Mm.
Yamaguchi,
Mhm.
whose families were rounded up and put into relocation camps. And
Mhm.
meanwhile, while mom and dad are in the relocation camp, the son, he enlists in the army and he goes off to fight in Europe. As a matter of
Wow.
fact, there was a segregated unit that was comprised completely of Japanese Americans. It was
Wow.
called the 442nd Infantry Regiment,
Mm-hmm.
and all of the frontline soldiers were Japanese. They were Japanese Americans. They were firstborn. You know, some of them had even lived in Hawaii. A lot of them
Mm.
lived in California, and the irony, and I think if you look back on it, almost the humorous irony is that more medals of honor came out of the 442nd Infantry Regiment than any other unit that fought in the war.
Wow.
Wow. That
Yeah,
that's
so here you had these, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. How does that happen? All of a sudden you're in the Pacific Theater, and now you're going tank to tank with the American Japanese versus the Japanese. I mean,
mm.
that's pretty hard, I would think. Did they, unless they didn't fight on that side, did they go over there, do you think?
Well, most of the Japanese Americans actually fought in the European theater.
Okay. Okay. In the
Yeah,
European theater. Okay. And then the Pacific theater, that happened because of Pearl Harbor, right? That's
absolutely.
when way on, and
Mhm.
nobody thought that would happen, right? They didn't think that that would occur. Like the
hmm
actual Pearl Harbor, that wasn't like a place that it was like it wasn't worth bombing. I hate saying that, but you know what I mean, that it wasn't worth doing it there. But and then the Japan, like they kind of thought the Japanese would never do that, it wasn't worth it, and then the Japanese did it and was like surprise, you know.
Right. Nobody really expected a first strike on Pearl Harbor, much less
Mm.
from the Japanese. We truly considered them to have a second-rate fighting force, and anybody who was anybody in the War Department at that time just said, "Hey, if we do get dragged into this war, the first strike is going to come from Europe long before
Mm.
it comes from Japan."
Mm. Wow. I want to just digress a little bit. We're talking about Japan going after China, right? And at the same
Yeah,
time, they're befriending the Nazis. Weren't there also families connected with China, like, Japanese and Chinese families that were united as one family as well? There's there's stories of relatives, like, again, fighting. But I think there was something happened there too. I'm not sure, but I don't know if I'm getting historical fiction novels and movies messed up with the actual reality of what happened. But I always thought there were like Chinese families that, had relatives on the Japanese side. And I
right.
maybe.
Oh, well, there was a lot of intermarrying
Mm.
among the Far East nations. You really saw it occur a lot with the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Chinese. Um, commerce among all three of those nations happened regularly. In 1910, the Japanese had actually annexed Korea, and then, of course, for the better part of a half century, the Japanese had occupied Manchuria and had more or less made it a Japanese protectorate. The Japanese owned all the railroads there, and they also had a permanent garrison of the Japanese army that was stationed in Manchuria long before the Second Sino-Japanese War ever happened. So there was a lot of mixing going on. You had Japanese who married Chinese, you had Chinese who married Koreans, and it produced a similar effect to what you saw in the American Civil War. We had brother against brother, and families, very big extended families, who split their loyalties between the North and the South.
So getting back to the Pacific Theater, here we have these tanks, and they didn't send as many as they did in the European theater.
No.
But now Japan had them and we had them. Who started the tanks?
Who started the tanks?
Yeah, who had them first? It's like when we were talking about the Tomcat, the F-14. It's like, okay, they started here, but then they had them over here, and you wouldn't believe it,
Right.
but they did. Especially now,
Okay.
right? Think about the history of the F-14 and what's going on now. I'm just saying,
Exactly.
there's some interesting history there of where
Yeah.
those fighter jets went. But now the tanks, who created the first one? What country?
Well, the first ones actually came out of both France and Great Britain. Those were the World War I tanks, and those were those large behemoths that you saw on the front lines in Europe, kind of like on the Maginot Line and whatnot. But it was really after World War I was over, the French and the British and the Americans, who had started developing their own tanks, was after the end of World War I that Japan really took a keen interest in it. They said, wow, here we have these large mechanical beasts that we think are going to be an asset for any future conflict that comes along. So the first tanks that got imported to Japan were British and French hand-me-downs. And it's kind of funny in the sense that the Japanese did to the tanks what they would later do to the automotive industry. They got Western models, they deconstructed them, they reverse engineered them, and said, okay, now from this, let's find out how we can make it better. And while the Japanese really excelled at making things like Hondas and Toyotas, the early tanks that they produced, I mean, for lack of a better term, those early Japanese tanks were garbage.
Compact.
Wow. And so then by the time World War II comes around, they bring their tanks. America brings their tanks. Where did they improve? Did the Japanese improve their tanks?
Well, they did, comparatively speaking, but even the best tanks that they fielded, I mean, they were just no match for like the American M4 Sherman, which is odd because the Sherman was actually qualitatively inferior to the German Panzers.
So wow,
it's interesting for such a small island to take on these huge other countries. It's odd, you wonder. I always think, well, why didn't you just not do it? Like, why'd you even get involved in the war? I don't see what they had to gain, quite frankly, because I mean, how could they even possibly win?
Well, in a lot of ways, they were betting the farm with Pearl Harbor. And I really think that it was a multi-tiered decision-making process. One is that they really wanted to expand their territory. They wanted to crush the Chinese will to try to take back Manchuria. They wanted to expand their footprint in the Pacific. And at the same time that was going on, you had a string of xenophobia that was running pretty deep within Japanese society, saying that they were being surrounded. They actually had a term for it. They were afraid of what was called the ABCD encirclement. They say that we're going to be surrounded by the Americans, the British, the Chinese, and the Dutch, And this
Mm.
ABCD encirclement is going to strangle us if we don't assert our dominance inside the Pacific.
Hmm.
So you had that going on, and I think that was step one. And then step two is, as the 1920s give way to the 1930s, they say, okay, well, given the comparative industrial picture here in Japan and over there in America, if we were to fight the Americans toe to toe, we stand a pretty good chance of losing. So let's stack the deck in our favor and let's make friends with public enemy number one in Europe,
Mm.
which is Germany at the
Yes.
time, because, Germany will definitely give America a run for its money, and it will
Mhm.
stack the deck in our favor if we ever have to go to war with the USA. And then third, they said, okay, well, if we do have to go to war against America, yeah, we're already friends with Nazi Germany, but we can do a pinpoint strike. And if we can take out Pearl Harbor in one fell swoop, then that will cripple America's ability to make war in the Pacific. And, they'll be more concerned with trying to repel a Japanese invasion on the California shores than they will be
Hmm.
yeah,
Okay. Yeah. Hmm.
as concerned about fighting in Europe.
Wow. So
Hmm.
they've got their tanks. So, but they went to different islands. They weren't just in, when you think about the Pacific Theater, they went, this war was in different places throughout the Pacific.
Yeah.
This was all over.
Yep, it sure was.
How did they get the tanks there on big, like, barge carrier things?
Absolutely. So you had these troop transport ships, and you also had cargo ships that were extremely effective in loading tanks and carrying tanks to their destinations. And a few miles offshore, there were actually two ways that you could have done it. There were these enormous landing crafts that were actually big enough to accommodate a tank. And if you didn't have enough of those landing craft to go around, then what you would do is you would modify the tank to be amphibious. You would have you would have a combination of a floating apparatus and a snorkel. And the snorkel, of course, would allow the engine to breathe, even though the tank was half submersed underwater.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was really how they got tanks to the shore. It was doing one of those two methods. Of course, the more effective method was getting the tank onto a landing craft, and then as soon as the landing craft hits the beach, the ramp drops and then the tank rolls off.
Mm.
Hmm.
And so
Wow.
you talk about predominantly two, the for the American side, the M3 Stuart and the M4 Shermans. So are we back to General Sherman again? Is that the same Sherman?
We are.
We're
Yeah.
back
That's
to
the
him.
same guy.
He's haunting us everywhere we go. Him and Fremont, I'm telling you. Everywhere we go, they pop up. And then the Stuarts, the M3 Stuarts. Who's the Stuart? Who was that?
The Stuart, yes. The Stuart is actually named after Jeb Stuart. He was a famous Civil War general on the Confederate side.
Hmm.
Okay, so we got Civil War generals, now
Mhm.
on these tanks, and then you had other ones. You had what, the China Girl? Is that it? Was have I got the right one here?
Oh yeah.
I went right down to it's David Bowie. Sorry, I like David Bowie has a tank. I don't know if you'd like that, but he has a tank. But then you've
Yeah.
also got like Colorado. So that we're always in. Nancy and I like to name like we name our car, and we maybe it's a girl thing, but I know ships are named, and you always see like the USS Arizona and all these different names. Is there like a chief namer in the military, or like how do they get their names?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit different of a dynamic in the Army. What you have for the Army, particularly what you have with tanks, is that you have a particular model tank, like the M4 Sherman, and that is its designation. Every M4 Sherman is pretty much the same thing. But then when you put those tanks down to the individual units, the companies like to give the tanks a lot of their individual names.
Yeah.
And the tradition is that you give a tank an individual name, and it has to be the same letter as whatever company the tank is assigned to.
Oh.
So if you are in Charlie Company, and let's say that Charlie Company is a tank company, and there are 16 different tanks within the company, every crew has to name their tank something colorful, something creative, but the only stipulation is that it has to begin with a C. So that's
Oh.
what you saw a lot in the book, people naming their tanks like China Girl and Colorado, and
Mm.
some of them even get a little more colorful. And I can give you a personal story
Yeah,
herein,
yeah.
Sure.
because as fate would have it, when I was a young tank platoon leader in the Army and I got to my first unit, we were blessed in the sense that we got brand new M1A2 Abrams tanks that were just coming off of the assembly line. And we were thrilled to have these. And because the tanks were brand new and we were taking over as the crews for these tanks, we got full creative license to name these tanks however we want.
Cool.
And I really had no preference on the name. I just said, you know what, whatever my crew agrees on, I will let them enjoy it. So they threw around a couple of different C names. And then my loader, I'll never forget this. My loader, he spoke up and he said, "Sir, how about we name this tank Christine?" And I said, "Christine, okay, well, how'd you come up with that?" And he said, "Sir, like the car in the John Carpenter movie." And I
Oh.
said, "Nice,
Oh.
okay, yeah."
Ah.
And I'll never forget the reason he gave for that. And, please bear in mind that I'm just repeating what he said. He said,
Mm.
"Yes, sir, we should definitely name this tank Christine because in the movie, that car was a mean bitch and so is this tank."
That's funny.
Well,
That's funny.
they could have named it Kit, like Kit, I Need You from
Yeah.
Knight Rider.
No,
Right.
I think Christine. I like that,
Yeah,
man.
she wins.
I like that.
Mm.
Yeah, no, that nothing with David Hasselhoff. Sorry, but then
I know.
Kit the car was pretty cool. Okay, I like that. I
Mm.
like the car. That was a mean
Mm.
machine. But
Mm.
that is so. Where were you? Was this in the States or were you overseas?
Yes, this was
Mm.
when I first got to Fort Bliss.
Mm.
Okay, okay. So you've been into tanks, forever. What's it like in a tank? Like for the civilian who's never, out here in Yuma, where we're stationed, here it is. For right now,
Mhm.
headquartered. We've got the Yuma Proving Grounds, and they've got these big tanks on the outside. And people go on a tour out here. They take them through the museum, and it's only open at special times and everything. So you see that, but I always go like, is it claustrophobic? Like I always think about being in a submarine, that same kind of feeling. Like I feel like a tank is a land submarine in a way. Is it like how many people can be in a tank?
Well, today on the M1 Abrams, we have a crew of 4, and even with
Mm.
that crew of 4, it's a pretty tight squeeze.
Mm.
You have the driver, you have the loader, you have the gunner, and then you have the tank commander. And it is a pretty tight squeeze, but you feel pretty alive when you're in there. I mean, the crew synchronicity, it really does get to a point where you can anticipate each other's moves, and you can even finish each other's sentences. And it's an incredible feeling. I won't necessarily compare it to a submarine in the sense that you have good visual of everything that's going on around you. But it is just an incredible thrill ride, especially when you see that main gun go off.
Mm.
And and it's even more impactful and even more memorable if you're outside of the tank when you see that main gun go off, because the concussion wave that blast gives, I don't care how tough you are, that will knock you right to your feet.
Really?
Which segues me into another personal story that I can tell. That's
Mhm.
a little funnier. We were doing tank gunnery one time. I want to say this was 2012. And we were doing tank gunnery. We were doing a platoon table 8 tank gunnery qualification, and we were doing a test fire of all the weapons to include the main gun. And me, just in whatever haste I was in, I put myself down into the hatch of the turret, but then I realized, oh my goodness, I left my notebook on top of the turret. So I plucked myself out of the turret, and I swear it wasn't for more than 3 to 5 seconds, just long enough to pop up and grab my notebook. And during that small, brief window of time that I put my head out of the turret, the tank that was about 7 to 8 feet away from me, it fired off its main gun, and and oh my God, the shock wave felt like somebody had taken a baseball bat to my helmet. I mean,
Wow.
it just knocked me flat. I fell back into the turret, and I'm like, oh my God, what the heck just hit me?
Oh,
Yeah,
Wow.
wow.
yeah, no,
So it's not like when you forget your coffee on the roof of your car.
right.
You know, not at all. I mean, I remember the first time, well, out here, we went out with the sharpshooters and they taught
Hmm.
us how to shoot. And I was like, just not good with guns, and for many reasons, because I've been on the other side of one that wasn't, a few times, and so is Nancy. But we both went and did this, and Nancy, she's braver than me on that kind of stuff. But I was like, I don't know, I was scared because it's like I think you have to have a trust in yourself. I'm like, what if I
Hmm.
sneeze and then the gun goes off or whatever? But you can't shoot these guns, and they're all historic rifles, and it wasn't AK-47s or anything. This was the old school style, and old big shotgun things, and but they trained you weren't allowed to do anything until you went through the steps, and you had to go through the steps and go through the steps before you could shoot it. And man, I almost fell backwards when that those guns can go off. So I can only
Yep.
imagine in a tank, like that feeling. My shoulders and arm hurt like the next week doing that. Mm-mm.
I
It's
believe it.
not like what you think in the movies. You see people just go bang bang. No, there's a lot of a throwback to that if you don't do it properly, I suppose, and I think that's part of it. But wow, I mean, this whole thing about being inside a tank, and so again, everyone, here it is. You've got to go get the book. It is out now on Kindle, and also you can go get it as a paperback. Looking at the paperback, it looks really neat because of the timelines, and you have all the photos and everything in
Mhm.
there, and a really good collection. How do you get all that? Were you able to interview people, or were you, like, I know when we talked about Tomcat Fury, you said you were able to go into like diaries and history and actually get the words of the pilots. Was it the same kind of thing for this?
Absolutely. Yeah. I was very fortunate to find a number of firsthand accounts and also a lot of official reports that the War Department had published after the conflict had ended. And yeah, these and at the time they were recorded, all the memories were still very fresh in the crew members' minds, and made for some very interesting reading.
Mm,
Hmm.
very cool. Very cool. Now, some personal stories here. And everyone, again, the book, you can go get it now. Again, also go through MikeGuardia.com as American Armor in the Pacific. Mike, before you go, a couple shout outs here. One, you got a shout out from John Grisham. Like, seriously, dude.
I did.
That's so cool.
Tell everybody
Wow.
about this.
Okay. So, as it were, John Grisham, one of his more recent novels is a book called The Reckoning, and I haven't read the whole thing yet, but so far so good. That you can pretty much expect any type of greatness, from the guy who did The
Yeah.
Firm
Yeah.
and all of those legal thrillers.
Pelican Brief. Yeah.
But in The Reckoning, much to my surprise, one of the books that he cites as being a resource for his writing was none other than American Guerrilla. And he
Mm.
said, I gleaned information from these sources, and sure enough, American Guerrilla by Mike Guardia was right there staring back at me. And I'm like, oh, cool.
I
Cool.
know. And so you
Very
you just
cool.
found that because of reading the book, reading The
I did.
Reckoning. Wow, that is so cool. That is awesome. And then I believe you also just earned another master's degree.
I did. Yeah.
Yeah, man. See, that's why he comes on the shows and educates us every time. I really
Mm-hmm.
appreciate it. I always learn something, and because it's like to piece history together like this. We've talked about. We have Nancy and I creating the chart of the world when she was doing a historical novel in Africa, and it's just hard to put it all in one big place, but you always do it. It doesn't matter what we bring up, man. Isn't that amazing, Nancy? Like, it doesn't
Yeah.
matter what we bring up on a conversation. It's like, well, this is how it happened. Like, I can't believe it. So congratulations on your degree, and also being cited in The Reckoning by John Grisham. That is awesome. What is the next book? Because I know there's more. I know there are. What's next?
Alrighty. Okay, let's see. Actually, there are 4 on tap for this year.
Wow.
One is called Wings of Fire. That is a combat history of the F-15.
Oh,
There's another one. There's another one called Danger Forward. It's a biography of a gentleman named Paul Gorman. And then there's Days of Fury, which talks about the Battle of 73 Easting, not from the perspective of Eagle Troop, but from the perspective of Ghost Troop, which fought on the northern flank of Eagle. And then finally, there is a book called The Combat Diaries, which is a collection of stories from the front lines of World War II.
wow, wow. This is exciting. Now, Paul Gorman, is that from reading your social media posts on Twitter and Facebook that I know that name, or
Yes.
why do I know? Okay, because Paul Gorman, I'm like, I know that name. And I know it from military history from some reason. You want to give everybody a little sneak preview of who Paul Gorman is?
Sure. So Paul Gorman, he is a 1950 West Point graduate, and got his baptism by fire as a young lieutenant in the Battle of Triangle Hill during the Korean War.
Hmm.
And fast forward to Vietnam, he leads the famous defense of Bong Trang in 1966, wherein he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for being able to repel what amounted to an entire battalion of Viet Cong soldiers, despite the fact that he was suffering from third-degree burns from napalm. So he comes back home after the war, becomes the principal architect of the infamous Pentagon Papers. And he also testified at the trial of Daniel Ellsberg. And then fast forward into the 1980s, he was the commander of U.S. Southern Command. And for those who might not be familiar with what that is, the Department of Defense has these unified combatant commands that are responsible for geographical areas of the globe. I'm sure most everyone has heard of CENTCOM. Well, that's Central Command. They're the ones that oversee the tactical deployments to the Middle East. Well, SOUTHCOM is responsible for all of the deployments to Latin America. And he was commanding Southern Command when we invaded Grenada in the 80s, and also when we had troops in El Salvador and Nicaragua.
Wow. Wow. This is going to be quite a story. We're looking forward to the next update and also our next chat with you. I know we're going to also be scheduling a segment in regards to the Hal Moore Museum, General Hal Moore Museum that we visited in Bardstown, Kentucky as part of our Love Your Parks tour, because Mike has also assigned Nancy and I to a Mission Possible story series, and it is to go and follow in the footsteps of generals like Hal Moore, especially the generals he's written about. We didn't expect to, literally stumble on Hal Moore's doorstep at his house, even, which is right around the corner from the museum. It happened, and also we've dug up all these general stories like General Sherman, General Grant, General Fremont, and that keeps going on and on. Every time I turn around, they're there. I swear these generals are like, come on, you got to write about me. Look at me. Look what I did. Do you feel that way? Do you get attached to who you write about, like that they just kind of, you see another angle, or like they introduce you to other generals to write about?
Right, and it's really hard not to get attached. I mean, when you're diving in and you're doing all that research, and you start talking to family members, and they really take a lot out of their day to help you craft a narrative. It's really hard not to feel that connection.
I want to do a segment on Lew Wallace, because he was in the governor's palace of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he's a general and did a lot of different things. But while he was there, he wrote Ben-Hur, and I'm like, what? I had no idea, and anyway, it's just everywhere we go, we see generals now. So there it Yes. Thanks so much for joining us, Mike. Everybody, again, MikeGuardia.com is the website to go to. You can also see his expert pages up on BlendRadioandTV.com and follow our general story on NationalParkTraveling.com. We always love to play music, and we're going to play this one again because I was just thinking about, here it is, the beginning of World War II, and here comes the tanks, and you're going out on these islands, and you got tanks that are used to being in Europe, but now you get to be in the tropical elements. So I got to play this song. It's called Fortune Favors the Brave, and it's from our friends of the Walkabout Band. They're based in New York and Australia. So I kind of felt there was a connection with that for some, I don't know, just saying. They like to get on boats and sail. So, there you go. And you can keep up with them at walkaboutband.com. They've got new music on the way, so we're looking forward to that. And of course, keep up with us, everybody, at bigblendradio.com. We appreciate you joining us and taking a listen to what Mike Guardia has to say. Thanks so much, Mike.
All righty, ladies, it is always a pleasure to be on your show. Thank you for having me.
Your breath, 'cause it may